Hello, if you have been tuning in recent weeks, then you will know that I have begun these videos of late with this disclaimer. You may hear the sound of children playing outside my office. There are a couple of schools that are in session and they're spending as much time outdoors as possible during this pandemic for safety reasons, and so they will be playing, they will be shouting, and you may hear some of that in the background. I apologize in advance if it is a distraction to you, and I hope that it actually brings you some amount of joy to hear children at play, as it does me. All of that being said, all distractions aside, I'd like to introduce our text for today, which is Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And it goes, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. I have become convinced that we spend so much of our life discovering the beauty and the priceless treasure that is there just underneath our noses. And if we don't spend most of our life discovering that treasure, we spend much of our life ignoring it or missing it. And it is a shame. Just a few weeks ago in our midweek Bible study, we considered a story in which Abraham played host to not only divine beings, but to God. And he didn't know it, but he treated these divine beings to a sumptuous feast, only to discover that he had been playing host to God and God's servants the entire time. And he learned that you might just be entertaining angels. As a matter of fact, we believe that behind every person, in the face of every person, and behind the eyes of every person, we see an image of God. We are always, in one way or another, entertaining divine persons. So we should be very careful and even deferential when we speak to others. You never know if you are trespassing on holy ground when you mistreat another. Today's story is a story about a man who did not know that he was, of all things, standing on holy ground. He was guarding sheep on holy ground. Just a normal day for Moses. He was making sure his father-in-law's flock was well kept. It was the busy work that you and I try to make interesting, keeping your mind occupied with various thoughts or reflections. Who knows what he was daydreaming about? This is the headspace he was probably in. Think about the headspace that you are in when you are doing something mundane, not expecting anything extraordinary to happen. Then he looks up and he sees that a bush is on fire. But the interesting thing about the bush was that it was on fire but not burning up. Very odd. In fact, as I said, extraordinary. So Moses tables his to-do list. He probably just leaves the sheep to their own devices, and he goes and checks out this sight. And he approaches, and then God speaks to him from the bush and calls him by name. Moses acknowledges this, and then God says, Come no closer, remove your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. What seemed before to be plain old dirt and dry rocks is called holy ground. The mundane is elevated and given importance and significance. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So it's just a normal day, as I've been saying, just normal space, except Moses discovered that beneath the mundane was the astonishing, the beautiful, the powerful. makes you wonder what it is that we miss. What am I missing right now? What are you missing right now? And in recent weeks, we've been talking about the things that we miss, the things that we fail to acknowledge. More specifically, we've been talking about currencies, various gifts and possessions that the community has to share with the world that it misses when it only focuses on currency as money. Eric Law, in his book Holy Currencies, writes that various currencies in churches, the currencies that we possess must be noticed, acknowledged, named, and they must flow. They must be shared with the community and then those outside of it. Otherwise, they are lost. They stagnate. Relationships never deepen. Truths are never named. Talents and strengths are lost or never put to good use. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when holy places are never noticed. What happens when Moses fails, or if he had failed, what would have happened if he had failed to see the divine in the mundane? Moses noticed a holy place. Now, before I continue, I should acknowledge that he had a bit of an advantage in his case. After all, the bush was burning. I think that might catch just about anyone's attention. He'd have been pretty thick to have missed it. But I'm wondering if we aren't missing holy places around us all the time. Some places are obviously holy, as noticeable as that burning bush. For example, our sanctuary here at Northwood Christian Church. And boy, don't we know that it is a holy place in the context of this pandemic. We miss it deeply. I can hardly walk through it when I walk into my office. I sometimes will go into the sanctuary and just take stock of the room, breathe in the room. And it makes me sad because I miss you in it, because that is the holy place where we gather and we notice one another in that holy place. So we want to return to that place because it's a sacred place, as obvious to us as a burning bush. To return to that place where we have felt the same impulse that Moses had, to take off his sandals because he was on holy ground. This translates today as don't run in the sanctuary. Don't speak loudly in the sanctuary when you are not supposed to. Don't eat in the sanctuary. And yes, I am reliving my childhood at this point. I remember older ladies getting upset at me when I was a kid for sitting with my shoes on the pew in the sanctuary because this was disrespectful. It was to not acknowledge and notice the place that I would discover to be holy. And then I used to roll my eyes, and it annoyed me. I did not understand back then that they were in their own way trying to differentiate between that holy space and all the other spaces. Today, I'm wanting to challenge the barriers that we create between holy places and the places that we erroneously think of as mundane. I think that the holy places are all around us. That we, like Moses, are very near, if not right on top of holy ground all the time. But these spaces are wasted if they are not noticed. Let's start with the room that you are now sitting in. If you're watching this, you may be thinking that this is a poor substitute for the real thing, the sanctuary, the singing, and everything else that goes on in church. And you may be right. For some people, I think that is certainly right. Others seem to appreciate this digital discourse. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I like both for different reasons, but many of us feel this a very poor substitute. And as a matter of fact, I will say yes, this is not as good as seeing you face to face, flesh to flesh, handshakes and hugs. So you are not in the sanctuary. You're not in the place that you have already determined to be holy, because it is. You are in your kitchen or your bedroom or your living room. You may be sitting or standing. Where? Challenge you. Think of it this way. How if you are now, in this moment, sitting, standing, occupying a space that is sacred, holy ground. In fact, you are, if only you had the eyes to see it. And what is a holy space? It's a space that is a conduit between you and the divine, you and God and God's love and knowledge and wisdom about God. And that space for you today, right now, that holy space is where you are. You who are made in God's image. You just need the eyes to see it. And we desperately need the eyes to see it in this hopefully brief era of digital worship. I'm remembering Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman that he met at the well. And he said something there that is astonishing, but very relevant to the moment in time we find ourselves in today. After she told Jesus about the physical space, the mountain her ancestors had set aside for worship, Jesus responded, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." He went on to say, the hour is coming and it is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him. He is hinting at a time, he's more than hinting at a time, he is prophesying into the ether, a time that he said was then and is still now, when people will realize that you don't need to gather at a specific mountain to encounter God, that God's Spirit will find us when we turn to find it. Which means right now, in your humble home where you are watching this, God is there. God is with you. Do not miss the fact that you are now on holy ground. This space is holy, and it gives me chills to think about it. So I miss the sanctuary as much as many of you, but do not miss what is right beneath you. Holy ground is made holy, I believe, by the presence of God. And the presence of God is where those made in God's image reside. Church buildings and church properties are said to be holy ground, and I'm not disputing this. In fact, I believe that certain spaces are rendered more sacred by their designation. So I'm starting to respect more and more the sentiment of those women who in my youth and childhood would tell me to keep my feet off of the pews in the sanctuary. But one thing I notice in churches are empty rooms, classrooms that no longer serve as meeting spaces for congregants. But we don't want to change them because we have thought of them as holy in a very distinct and specific way set back decades. Fellowship halls that sit with no one gathering in them, just the memories of what happened there when they were used. One of the rooms that stood out to me when I first visited Northwood and first came to Northwood and began to walk around the building on my own was the choir room on the 3rd floor. By the time I arrived, there were congregants who could not gather in that space because it was inaccessible, because there's no elevator access to the 3rd floor. But with an elevator, even, there's no choir. And so it is a room that is haunted. My main problem with the room is not that there's no access to it, although I wish there was access to every room for all persons in our building, something we should be thinking about. But the real problem with that room is that it's haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories of its past. Let me explain. There sits on shelves stacks and stacks of board games, or there did at the time when I first got here. Stacks and stacks of board games that were presumably once played by people decades ago, now gathering dust. A ping pong table that sat there gathering dust. There stood in the corner shelves and shelves of trinkets and objects that had been relegated there over the years as the choir room became more and more of a storage closet than anything else. Choir robes gathering dust. Like I said, haunted. It's like the bedroom of a child that has moved out and the parent cannot change a thing about it because they are haunted by the memories, blessed by the memories, but also stuck in the memories. At least that's how that room seemed to me, not having had those powerful feelings for that room, not having shared that space in the ways that it had been shared with others in the past. So many good memories made in that room. And when I first arrived at Northwood, many of you would describe to me what it was like to practice in that room, to put on the choir robes and sing songs together. Beautiful, beautiful memories. You spoke as if the room were still alive and kept in more than memory, a fact that stood rebuked by the reality. Because when I made my way upstairs and entered into that space, what I found was a fine room, but empty and void of life. Sure, echoes of the past were reverberating off the walls, but the space was hollow. Can a space be sacred without life? Can a room be holy without holy persons living life, creating beauty inside? Is a sanctuary sacred without people? Is a choir room sacred without its singers? But every empty space has potential. If we are to think of our spaces, the physical locations that Northwood owns, as currency, then we must find ways to let the currencies flow. And so now I'm really talking specifically about this currency of place. Eric Law writes of this currency. Currency of place refers to the properties from which your church/ministry operates and other properties owned by or which can be accessed by your church or ministry. He goes on. If a church only uses the building a few hours a week for worship and the building is locked the rest of the week, this church is not maximizing its currency of place. He concludes, in order to maximize the currency of place, we need to invest our currency of both time, both paid and volunteer workers, in making the place flow with activities that are exchanged for other currencies, such as those of gracious leadership, relationship, truth, wellness, and eventually money. I emphasize, Heath Jones here, emphasizes eventually money, because the raising of money to sustain a building only matters if that space is truly reclaimed as holy ground. And this is in part what is happening at Northwood. You may already know this, but our space is being used by a variety of groups. We lease the space out to art studios, schools, choirs, and even other churches. And if you were to go up to that old choir room these days, you'd discover that it is no longer haunted. In fact, look at it. These are the pictures of what is happening there now. It is filled with life-giving activity. Children are honing their skills at pottery. They are creating art out of glass. This is more than a start. Now, the currency of space is beginning to flow. But here's where even more work comes in. Eric Law is right to point out that unless we, the church people, invest our time in these sacred places, the currency of place does not come back around to feed us. I would suspect that many of you did not know that our choir room was being used in this way. And so how has the currency of place beginning to flow come back around to feed us? In other words, whilst the wonderful work of our tenants is a blessing to those who participate, it has hardly an impact on Northwood, the church, the people in the church, unless we invest our currency of time in these endeavors. And so here's where we have to connect our time in this space with the time of others who are occupying this space. And we started to do just this last year. You may remember the open house that we hosted. All of our tenants put their best foots forward, and we opened up their spaces to the public to showcase what they do. And I really wanted to bring in members from our church to see what's going on in this building from Monday through Saturday. And many of our church members made their way up to the third floor for the first time in years. And we were amazed to discover the richness uncovered, the spaces that have been reclaimed as holy in our building as they are filled with God's children. Then there was Global Fest, the festival that we hosted on behalf of IPS School 70. Thousands of people trafficked our property. This space was again reclaimed on a Saturday as holy space, being trafficked by people who are made in God's image. And if you were here, it was amazing. And Northwood, of course, had a presence. We passed out information about our church, and we met new people, and we passed out coffee. And we will host them for years to come. That relationship between us and that school just across the street is deepening. So that brings us back to last week, where we talk about the currency of relationships. They all work together. Unfortunately, the pandemic has in many ways curtailed our abilities to deepen the relationships that have begun to develop through our planning events like the Open House or Global Fest. And in the future, we hope to pick up where we left off, and now we're even trying to find creative ways to make these connections. In the meantime, what sacred spaces might we discover at Northwood or think about in new and creative ways? There are obvious examples. One is that every Saturday, our parking lot becomes a sacred place, holy ground. It becomes holy when it serves this as the staging area for the feeding of the hungry. The high priests or the volunteers that carry bags of groceries to the cars for those who have need. But what else are we missing? Well, our church grounds will become holy yet again on Christmas Eve. Even though we will be outside and in our cars, the parking lot will be holy as we host a Christmas Eve service open to the public. And I hope primarily attended by those we've yet to meet. But looking even further into the future, what then when we are back in our building as usual? And that time will come. I just got hung up on those last words. Per usual. When we are back in our building per usual, we must not get hung up on the per usual. How might we use our currency of space and time and cause it to flow in new ways? The past does not repeat itself. We must look into the future. And how can we connect what happens these days in the choir room? Even today, I saw the teacher going up to the classroom today. What can we do to connect what happens in there that is life-giving and holy these days with the community at Northwood? How might the holy work of our preschools impact the holy work of Northwood's gospel mission? Yes, I'm inviting you into a brainstorming session that you can think about and call me about later this week. Here's where we must circle back to the conversation that we had 2 weeks ago about the currency of relationships, and I alluded to this just a second ago. We are going to have to get to know our neighbors that are in this building, and develop true and honest relationships with them, with our tenants and those who they serve. And as we do, we will discover the treasure trove of currency that is our building and property, and the ways in which they are flowing, sourcing new and wonderful life. It does not always have to have Northwood Christian Church's brand to be a benefit to Northwood Christian Church. But the currency of space has to flow. No room should sit empty, haunted by its past. This week, the Leadership Council began a very exciting conversation about the ways we might utilize the property during the pandemic. I mean, why pay for landscaping if we aren't even walking on the property? So we're beginning to envision outdoor events for the public so that we may share our space with the community and thus reclaiming it as holy. The Christmas Eve service is more than a start, but how about another Christmas event? And the ideas for this are just germinating and need to get off the ground quickly because we are about a month and a week away from Christmas. One person on the council suggested something as simple as cookies. We could pull that off. How if we set up some Christmas version of Trunk or Treat where instead of handing out Halloween candy, we passed out cookies that we've made and then invited others in the community to share their cookies, their goodness, this goodness with the community, to gather in a safe way during the pandemic, meeting out on the sidewalk at different stations, an opportunity that has been all too rare these days. That is an opportunity to meet with one's neighbors, to connect with one's neighbors. So I'm trying to paint a picture of how this might look. It's not some abstraction. It really happens when you put in the time, in the place, to deepen the relationships and the currency of relationships and truth-telling and all the things that we've been talking about and will continue to talk about. The currency of space and the currency of our time flowing. The very sidewalks around our building become holy ground as they are trafficked by those who are made in God's image. Our parking lot, every closet, each space in our facility has the potential to become sacred once again, or for us to discover that it is even now sacred space and holy ground. But we have to let that space, the currency of that space, flow. We cannot let choir rooms become storage closets or classrooms become gathering space for dust bunnies. We've got to let our currency of place flow. And we are starting it and we are doing it, but there is more to come. We just need to connect some of the dots, connecting the life that happens in our building with the life that happens at Northwood Christian Church on usual Sundays. And here we circle back to the currency of relationships. You see how it's all connected. So the next time you enter into our building, you might have to fight the impulse to take off your shoes. You may hear a subtle voice from your depths. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I hope you can hear this echo, this voice, where you sit right now, as you reclaim where you are sitting as holy space. You might even, the next time you come here, have to fight the impulse to hide your face as you grapple with this reality that in this holy sacred place that we call Northwood, you have been presented with the opportunity to look on the face of God. After all, do we not see in one another the very image of God? This may happen even on this holy ground that we call Northwood Christian Church. Let the treasure of this space flow.